In a few short days, it will be International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Here at WPBS, we recognize the importance of this landmark day. Tonight, we offer two powerful pieces of survival. The first takes place at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. It was here that 982 Jewish refugees were safely housed during the war, several of them prisoners of Auschwitz. Many don't realize that Fort Ontario was the only place in the U.S. that opens its doors to the refugees, but it was. Our Jolene DeRosier has more.
This is a story of freedom, of change, of new lands and new people. It's the story of the 982 Jewish refugees that landed at Fort Ontario in Oswego in August of 1944, never anticipating the warm welcome they would receive from the community. For the first time in a long time, they were experiencing freedom.
For years we hadn't seen it. It was enormous impact of all this around us. Freedom, food, shelter, not being scared of your lives anymore. The first night I slept was right here in Oswego. Slept all through without fear.
The journey began in Italy, where thousands of refugees hid during the war. It was here that close to 3,000 of them applied for a program that would bring them to America. Only 1,000 would get in. The program was the brainchild of President Roosevelt, who decided to circumvent strict U.S. immigration quotas and allow the group into the country as his guests. 982 Jewish refugees were put aboard an Army troop ship with another 1,000 injured soldiers. They sailed towards freedom for 2 weeks and then headed to Fort Ontario by train. Their first impression, however, wasn't one of freedom.
Many of the refugees were terrified as a train pulled into the Fort Ontario military reservation on the morning of August 5th, 1944, because they saw a fence. It was a typical chain link fence with barbed wire, typical Army post fence, but it reminded many, over 100 of these refugees had been incarcerated in Nazi concentration camps in Germany, Poland, and they were terrified.
Thankfully, that fear didn't last. Oswego residents were quick to learn more about their new neighbors, even if their history and the tragedy they befell was new information.
Oswego was an all-American community. It was comprised of all different nationalities, all different cultures. There was a thriving Jewish community in Oswego.
The fencing was part of a quarantine, and the immigrants were required to stay behind it for 30 days. Once the quarantine was lifted, they would be free to leave the fort, so long as they stayed within city limits. Of course, some found their way through the fence to get a bigger taste of freedom.
And as far as we were concerned, the fence was a non-entity. The fence didn't bother us. My first introduction to the fence was on the same evening when we arrived. We went out there to the fence. On the other side of the fence were a bunch of Oswego teenagers, many girls.
While teenagers found their way into the community found their way to the refugees. And before long, the two communities became one.
And we have a lot of stories of community members actually going to the fence, sharing their toys, their food, their desserts, communicating, playing games through the fence. After the first month, when refugees were allowed to leave the camp on day passes, they would go to individuals' homes. They would interact with the community.
Waterbury, the publisher and the superintendent of schools and other citizens got together a committee to help service the refugees and help them when they arrived. So community response is very strong officially to welcome and help acclimate the refugees to Oswego.
In May of 1945, Germany surrendered, and World War II in Europe came to an end. For the refugees, it meant their time in Oswego was over. As part of FDR's original order, they were required to go back to Europe after the war. But President Truman determined that the Oswego refugees, who had no legal status in the U.S., would be given first consideration for citizenship. 70 communities across the country offered invitations.
They had to leave the country and go to Canada, across the Rainbow Bridge. And then all their paperwork had been processed beforehand. And then when they got to the customs office in Canada, U.S. Customs, then they were able to come back in the country with their visas in hand and all certified.
We often say that the Safe Haven story is woven into the fabric of our community, and it's often a story that's not told unless it's prompted. So many people don't even know that the refugee camp existed, but it's there. It's in their memories, it's in their history, and it takes one simple conversation, one box, one photograph to really spark that.
Many stayed in the States and many went back to Europe. Today, the Safe Haven Museum at Fort Ontario remains as the primary reminder of the 982 refugees who spent 18 months in the city of Oswego. It was the only city in all of the U.S. that opened its doors to the refugees, putting the small city on the historic maps in a very big way. At Fort Ontario in Oswego, for WPBS Weekly, I'm Jolene DeRosier.